the inclusion of individuals with disabilities in sport in Peoria, in Illinois, and on the global level. Our speakers, who will be introduced in a few minutes, bring a variety of perspectives as community advocates, coaches, athletes, and managers. Before I introduce the panelists, I would like to introduce our moderator, who is Katie Van Cleve, and she's actually a Bradley graduate, and we're really pleased to have her back on campus today. Katie is an executive director of the Heart of Illinois Special Recreation Association. She's a graduate of Bradley in social work and psychology with a minor in political science. Is that right? I mean, she just piled everything on there. Get the most out of it. All right, go now. You everyone go out there, pick up 2 more majors or something. In her career of over 20 years, she has been committed to serving individuals with disabilities. She created the Peoria Wildcats wheelchair basketball team, the Access Team program for the Steamboat Classic race, and the Access the Experience event held in conjunction with the IHSA March Madness. You might have met Katie on campus a few weeks ago when the Peoria Wildcats played a pickup game in the Marking Center as a part of the Body Project's event on disability. Before we begin the panel, I would like to invite Chelsea Everett, who is a student in Bradley University social work program, to say a few words about Katie and recognize her.
Such an inspiration to us, and we would like to thank you from the Bradley University Students Service Association with this certificate to show how much we appreciate all the service that you've given our community and as such an inspiration as future graduates. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. So joining Katie Van Cleve on the stage is Mike Van Cleve, coach of the Peoria Wildcats basketball team. Mike has served in a variety of roles in which he performed accessibility reviews and oversaw compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act. He graduated from the University of Illinois, where he played wheelchair basketball. Welcome, Mike. Speaking of the University of Illinois, we like to make friends with the universities in the state. Joining us today is also Stephanie Wheeler, head coach of the women's wheelchair basketball team at the University of Illinois. Stephanie is a 3-time Paralympic gold medalist. She won gold with Team USA as an athlete in Athens in 2004 and in Beijing in 2008, and as a coach a couple of months ago in Rio. Thank you for being here, and congratulations on your accomplishments. Finally, representing Bradley University. Taylor Jackson, senior sports communication student. Taylor has been very involved with the Bradley community as he works for the Office of Diversity and Inclusion and serves as a manager for the women's basketball team. Taylor has also been instrumental in organizing the previously mentioned Body Project event a few weeks ago on campus. We're excited that he agreed to be on this panel and share with us his experiences at Bradley. Thank you all for being here.
Thanks so much for having us. Let me know if you can't hear me. I'm just going to start by asking a few questions to give a little bit of background for those of you who maybe aren't familiar with adapted sports. So we're going to just kind of make it a discussion, and then we're going to give some time at the end to ask some questions. So don't hesitate to do that when the time comes. Thanks for coming, guys. The first question I have is just to kind of start a discussion about what is adapted sport. And I know that's a really big question, but if you guys can kind of give us, from your perspective, what is adapted sport, and we'll just kind of give that background and what opportunities are there. Steph, you want to start?
I would love to. So I kind of see adapted sport in a pretty broad spectrum. I think when you go by, I guess, the definition, and when you say adapted sport, right, like it's changed in some way, like some fundamental part of the game has changed. I think initially we see adapted sport as sport for people who have disabilities. I think that's where we generally go with it. I see it in a little bit different way. I see it as sport, and a sport that anybody can play, and it just has different equipment or adapted equipment to be able to play. So that's kind of the way that I look at adapted sport. I guess there are lots of opportunities, especially here in the state of Illinois. I think we're really fortunate that we have a lot of our special recreation organizations in the state, here in Peoria, up in the Chicagoland area, or where they're more densely located. But there's plenty of opportunity for young people with disabilities, especially, and adults with disabilities, to be able to participate in sport. Basketball is a super popular one here in the state, but there are other options with track and field or swimming. So you can compete at that level, which is generally the elementary school, middle school, high school level. We are fortunate to have a program at the University of Illinois where we have track and field and men's and women's wheelchair basketball that we have as an option. And then when you take that next step forward on a more national or global scale, you do have the opportunity to go compete on the Paralympic level. So depending upon the age you are and the level at which you're wanting to perform or wanting to play, there's a lot of options that you can take advantage of.
I think it's interesting, and kind of piggybacking on what Steph said, when we practice with our wheelchair basketball team, a lot of our athletes' siblings will jump in extra chairs. And I think if you ask those siblings whether they're playing an adapted sport, they would say they're just playing sports. They're playing sports with their siblings. And so I think while it's important for us to understand what is the kind of technical background behind adapted sport, it's kind of, the way I equate it is, when you were a kid and you were playing with somebody and their abilities were different, or you kind of played pickup ball. You changed the rules to fit the house, or fit what you were doing. And so I think that adapted sport is just an extension of that. It's a way for individuals to feel inclusive in their environment and to engage with their peers on a competitive level.
Yeah, I think adaptive sport is kind of a release. It's kind of therapeutic through performance for people with disabilities to be able to showcase what they're capable of on a platform, given that, they might not otherwise have, and get to be involved and included instead of feeling excluded through performance in whatever their favorite sport is.
Mike, you talked about siblings jumping in chairs. How does one qualify to participate in adapted sports?
Absolutely. The qualifications for different sports vary depending on the sport. As far as wheelchair basketball, you have to have a condition that affects the lower half of the body that precludes you from participating in another sport. And so maybe that's a leg length discrepancy, maybe it's an amputation, maybe it's a spinal cord injury, maybe it's something from birth like cerebral palsy or spina bifida, but something that limits you from full participation in other sport is typically one of the qualifying factors. So.
In wheelchair basketball specifically, because I know we're pretty wheelchair basketball heavy on this panel, but hey, it's Illinois, so. We have a classification system. Stephanie, can you tell us about that classification system and how that works?
Yeah, so the really cool thing about wheelchair basketball, and I think I'm a little bit biased because it is my favorite sport, but I think the really interesting thing about it is that you do have a wide spectrum of disabilities that can play. Like Mike was describing, you have folks who, if you saw them walking around, you would never know that they were eligible for wheelchair sports because they've had like a severe knee injury playing able-bodied basketball, and they're not allowed to play anymore, and so then they can play wheelchair basketball. Down to someone like me who uses a chair to get around every day. And so you have a really wide spectrum. And you want to make it so that's inclusive for all of those athletes to be able to play. And so what they do is they get a number based on their functional ability on the court. So it doesn't really have anything to do with their skill level or anything like that. It's based on their muscular functional ability. And the highest number that you can get is a class 4.5, and that's your below-the-knee single amputees, your knee injuries that I was talking about, all the way down to a class 1.0, which are your higher-level spinal cord injuries. And at any point in time on the court, you can only have 14 points on the court. So it's a little bit of a math game when you're coaching, but you want to make sure that you're getting as balanced of lineups as you can on the court. And that way, teams aren't putting their most muscular, functional people on the court at all times, that it is a sport that's being played for everyone and it's being inclusive. So it's just the way we keep things a little bit balanced on court.
I know, Mike, you coach at the junior level. How do they apply that classification in the junior level, or do they?
At the junior level, they actually waive the classification system. They start to talk about it with juniors, especially juniors who are of an ability level that they're being scouted by colleges and universities. But as far as the junior level, because the focus, while it's on competition, it's also about making sure that, we draw kids from, well, let me say it this way. We're the only team south of I-80 and north of St. Louis. So if we have a number of kids, we can't necessarily guarantee that, that we can stay under the classification points based on the kids that we're drawing. And so that requirement is lax.
Besides the classification system, what other modification or adaptations to the game of basketball might you see in a wheelchair basketball game?
The
Take that
chair.
one.
The chair is a big one. I'm not sure if you guys have ever seen a sports chair of any kind. Specifically with a basketball wheelchair, it looks similar to my chair, like if you guys see me off stage, but a couple of modifications. Each chair is made specifically for each athlete. So it's kind of like a shoe. Like you guys wouldn't want to wear a shoe that is 3 sizes too big or that belonged to somebody else. And this actually kind of goes across the board for any other like adaptive equipment. If you see like a track and field athlete or anything like that, this is sort of the principle it's based on. Each chair is custom made to each athlete. You're going to have a wider base of support in a lot of sports chairs. So in my wheelchair, the wheels are straight up and down. In sports chairs, you're going to see that the wheels are cambered a bit. That's for basketball, tennis, track and field, like any other sport that uses a chair. A lot of them will have strapping, and quite often we use the bindings that are on snowboards that you bind your feet down with. We have those that we basically ratchet ourselves into chairs because you want the chair to be one with your body. When you move, you want the chair to move. Trying to think, a lot of times they'll have, we call them 5th and 6th wheels on the back of the chair. That's so when you lean back, you don't fall over. Gives you an opportunity to create a little space between you and a defender. You won't see those on track chairs, however. You will see those on tennis chairs. So a lot of it is very much so custom and based to the athlete that they're measuring it for. Again, it's that shoe analogy. You want the straps to be tight, just like you want your shoelaces to be tight. You want the chair made for you, just like you want to go out and buy your own pair of shoes for tennis or basketball or running or something like that. So that's one of the biggest adaptations that you'll see. As far as rules go, it's basically the same game that you guys see played all the time. Biggest rule differences are, for us, there's no double dribble. Just because you can't move laterally in a basketball chair. It's almost impossible. You can't go side to side. And so, therefore, we don't have that double dribble rule. It makes dribbling a little more functional on the court. But that's the biggest change or adaptation. Traveling, just like in stand-up ball, it's 2 steps. You can take 2 steps, you have to dribble, pass, or shoot. Same with wheelchair basketball. 2 touches of your wheels, and you have to dribble, pass, or shoot.
Yeah, I think as far as the adaptations, a lot of that stuff has been athlete-driven. With the 5th and 6th wheel, it was done kind of as a safety concern when people got a lot more physical in the kind of late 90s, early 2000s, and you saw a lot more kind of taller people banging around in the key. And then a lot of the other stuff comes from people just kind of naturally trying different things, pulling things from different sports. The snowboard bindings really started and came about when Steph and I were in college, and before that we were using Velcro and kind of looping things through, and so it's really interesting when you see an athlete who really is pushing the boundaries of sport and what's possible, and seeing the game adapt to that. I think a good comparison to that would be, was it Venditti who switched arms with the switch batting, and they had to create a rule to adjust to that. A lot of that is very similar in wheelchair sports in that, oh, we didn't know that was possible, and so so they kind of
Now we've got to
adapted.
create a rule.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Can you tell me, and I'm not sure which one of you wants to take this question, but can you tell me, we hear a lot about Special Olympics. What's the difference between adapted sports and Special Olympic sports?
I volunteered with the Special Olympics a while ago in 2004, and one of the things that's like different to me is that it's kind of become this specialized global showcase for people with all disability, you know, to showcase what they can do performance-wise, you know, in whatever venture they choose to create. It's like, for me, it's like a personalized experience with a lot of adaptive sports and wheelchair sports. It's specific to one sport, but you can cover so many within the Special Olympics that I think it creates that personalized experience where it really has a lifelong impact and you can always go back and reflect on how that has brought you to the point, you know, where you on one of the biggest stages in the world, at least for disabled athletes.
And I think from, you know, those are some excellent points, and I think from a technical standpoint, adapted sports mainly focus, or all really focus on specifically athletes with physical disabilities, whereas Special Olympics focuses on individuals with developmental or cognitive disabilities. And so the main difference there, I think, is in that point. I think both have, you know, sport is sport. And so when you get out and compete against other people and compete against yourself, that is universal. But with adapted sports, I think it mainly focuses on the difference between physical disabilities and Special Olympics with cognitive and behavioral and developmental.
Can you tell me what challenges any of you have experienced in your pursuit to access sport?
I think one of the things at U of I that we're constantly trying to figure out where the best avenues for us is our relationship with our Division of Intercollegiate Athletics on campus. It's an interesting relationship that we have. So right now at the University of Illinois, we're not considered a varsity sport on our campus. We live in this little gray area between varsity sport and club sport, where we do get some perks and benefits of being varsity athletes. Our student athletes receive varsity letters. They use our student athlete academic center on campus, among some other, opportunities that they have access to. On the flip side, we don't really receive any scholarship funding, any of the media promotions, things like that, facilities, access in that way. So we sort of live in this weird gray area, and for us, it's been a constant battle of what's best for us as an organization and what's best for us, what's best for our student athletes, and their ability to have the full collegiate experience or full experience as a student athlete at the college level. And whether that experience is being diminished by the fact that they're not included in our Division of Intercollegiate Athletics. So that's, I think, for us at the collegiate level, that's the biggest challenge that we're facing right now is how do we navigate that, and is it better for us to be in our intercollegiate athletics, is the question that grounds it. And so, right now we're in a process of figuring that out for ourselves and what our relationship is with intercollegiate athletics. So at the collegiate level, that's a current battle or a current challenge going on for us right now is how do we navigate that and make sure our student athletes are getting the full educational experience while they're on campus with us.
From a juniors level, as somebody who came to wheelchair sports later in life, I actually didn't know about wheelchair sports until I got to college, where I was fully immersed in that. And coming from somebody who walks and was able to play sport on a certain level with peers, there's one of the challenges that we have with our team really revolves around athletes who are ambulatory. So your amputees, your athletes with cerebral palsy who walk on a daily basis, or leg length discrepancy, or one thing or another. And because there is that stigma that still is associated with playing basketball in a chair. And it's not just their peers, because from a lot of standpoint, we found that our athletes, friends and high school students and classmates are extremely supportive. But it actually comes from the medical model and even their parents, who are told from an early age that participating in anything but what we call able-bodied sport is less than acceptable. And so I think from one of the things that we have as a challenge, both from the people here on this panel, but also we in the greater sense, is kind of breaking that mindset and going, hey, it's just another piece of equipment. And so, and helping our athletes carry that confidence into those discussions with their parents to say, you know, this is something I really want to do, and have it be an open option for them.
One of the things that I found when I started a junior wheelchair basketball program about 15 years ago was it wasn't as easy to find athletes as I thought, because that medical model really, so many therapists and medical professionals were telling people with disabilities, you know, that their goal was to stay out of a chair. So when you spend the first part of, or the physicians and the therapists spend the first part of someone's life telling them, we want to keep you out of a wheelchair. So they're participating in things like physical therapy and occupational therapy specifically to stay out of a wheelchair. Then they meet someone like me on the street because I saw a kid with a limp, and so I followed him for a little bit to see, to see if he might be eligible to play. And I stalked the parent, and then I moved in, and I found out that they maybe have a mild case of spina bifida or something, and that parent looks at me a little crazy, thinking every other professional in my kid's life has said, let's keep this kid out of a wheelchair. And you walk up to me on the street and you say, I want to put your kid in a wheelchair, and I want to put your kid in a wheelchair so that your child can access sport. Parents are pretty leery of that, particularly when you approach them in the mall. So that, to me, has been one of the largest barriers, I think, to helping people access sport, because you have to get over kind of that psychological idea that my child will never be an athlete, or my child, we've been spending all this money on therapy, or we've been going to therapy 3 times a week specifically to keep my child out of a wheelchair. To then, look at that and say, hey, look at this wheelchair and view it as just another pair of shoes, it's a different mindset, and it's difficult to kind of get folks to wrap their brain around that for their child. I also think that in the early part of kids' lives, parents sort of grieve the loss a bit, and hopefully they go all the way through that grief process, but sometimes they don't. And so they've sort of resigned themselves to the fact that their child is never going to be an athlete. They're not going to play basketball or tennis or volleyball like I did. So it's a little hard to kind of retract that psychological state, to kind of let that parent know, hey, this is an opportunity, and it's a great opportunity. When we have kids come to basketball tournaments for the first time, it usually takes a little while to talk families into making the trip, because first of all, we don't get to drive across town and play a wheelchair basketball game. We're lucky in the Midwest, we get to drive a couple of hours to play a wheelchair basketball game, but we've got to drive hours to find another team, and so it's a huge commitment. But when kids walk into that arena, typically, and they see 3 or 4 courts, and every one of those athletes is in a chair like them, I think it's a little overwhelming for them in an extremely positive way. I think that a lot of times athletes find a peer group that they've never found before, and they see that as a very normal thing, which we all feel every day, but that's the first time a lot of times kids have felt like I'm a part of a team, and this is normal for me. So that's kind of a really long-winded response to my own question, but
One thing to add to that, and Steph, I don't know if you want.
I'll go after you.
There's also this misconceived notion by parents that by allowing their kids to participate in wheelchair sports, that's going to want to make their child use a wheelchair more often. And I will tell you, playing wheelchair basketball is by far the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. And getting out of that chair and appreciating the fact that I could walk and do, and go somewhere without having to plan my route first, it was something that it was very fortunate for me to be able to do, and something I don't take away, lightly from any of my teammates or friends. But somehow we need to break parents of that idea that somehow it's going to lure an able-bodied or maybe that's not the right term to be used anymore, ambulatory athlete to want to use a chair on a regular basis, but it's still there.
And I was actually going to touch on something completely different that can be a challenge with disability sport in general or adapted sport in general. And it's talking about the equipment, and it's talking about kind of the isolation of certain teams. And so, one, the equipment can be incredibly expensive. And so a lot of times, I'm really fortunate. It hasn't really been a barrier for me to participate in sport, but I know that I have interacted with a lot of people who their access to sport has been incredibly limited because they don't have the proper equipment to be able to play. A top-level wheelchair basketball wheelchair will cost you, upwards of $5,000-$6,000. So it's super expensive when you get at the highest level. Same with the track chair, possibly even more expensive. Same with the tennis chair, any other kind of adaptive equipment that you might need. And so that's one challenge that I think athletes with disabilities can face, is that the equipment in order to participate is super, super expensive. Along with that, like Katie said, a lot of times you have to drive a few hours to compete, and that's pretty indicative of the isolation that a lot of kids with disabilities feel. I grew up in a really small town. I was literally the only kid with a disability in my town. And my family had to drive me about 2.5 hours every week to go to basketball practice. And so that touches on a lot of things with either socioeconomic status, parental support, whatever familial support that you have. So I think there are a lot of challenges and factors that can go into disability sport that actually make it quite inaccessible for some of the athletes who would actually really enjoy participating or would reap huge benefits from participating in sport. And I think that's something actually, as like a disability sport community, we have to do a better job of addressing and really figure out like how to make sport accessible in that way.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think one of the things that I also found challenging from my standpoint when working to create sport opportunities for youth with disabilities was definitely the access to equipment, but was also how to get kids there. Mm-hmm. That was a huge challenge, was getting kids to the actual practices, because we were the only team between south of I-80 and north of St. Louis. So when we had a practice on a weeknight, there were kids that were driving a couple of hours just to get to our practice. And that's a lot of lost homework time, it's a lot of lost chore time, it's a lot of lost family time. So sometimes it was a decision for the family between, can we commit to that both financially and from a time standpoint, or, is our time and money better used somewhere else, which is really unfortunate, because you can't just go out and play a pickup game of wheelchair basketball typically on your neighbor's, driveway. So unless you live in the Van Cleve neighborhood, and then we provide the chairs. So so that is one that I think is, you're right, it has to be addressed. And what do you feel like your community or local communities could do to kind of reduce or eliminate those barriers? Taylor, do you have any thoughts about that?
I just think one way is to let them know that they have the support of everyone around them, and letting them know that they have access to just as much as everybody else do if you connect them with the right people, because we spend so much time telling people to connect, network, and work with these different groups of people, and it's like when it comes to people with disabilities, we kind of give them just enough to get by, but giving them that same ample opportunity to have as much resource and support from everyone else around them so they can have just as much of a shot. I kind of feel like sometimes we just give them just enough, like, okay, like, well, you have a ramp in front of a building, you know, what about when you get inside? What if it's no elevator, now you got to take the stairs? It's all these different alternatives that I think we kind of take for granted, that we need to start looking at these little things and understanding, like, you know what, this is a barrier, how can I help? You know, not just saying, we'll get you in, but then the rest you have to figure out on your own.
I think that's a good point, and I think it's something that I practiced architecture for 9 years. My degree is in architecture. I specialized in the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Fair Housing Act, consulting developers, contractors, and architects all over the country in that. And one of the things I really tried to stress to them is making accessible design part of the overall design. You know, from a community aspect, we live in the connection economy. I mean, we live in an unprecedented time where I could jump on Google Hangouts and talk with somebody halfway around the world. And the fact that it's so difficult for us to connect with athletes here in Central Illinois is something that's kind of always puzzled me. And I think that goes back to getting the word out, and events like this, getting the word out to people who are students, who are physical therapists, who are doctors, in helping us make those connections. And so I think that's really the most crucial part is helping break those stereotypes and make those connections to get athletes involved in sport early on in life.
And I think too, like, it's thinking about like how we make equipment affordable. So, you know, there's a company out of China right now that like will make a basketball wheelchair for like $250. And you know, it's how do we do that in the States, right? How do we make wheelchairs that are affordable? They don't have to be top of the line. They don't have to be fancy. They need to move, and they need to be able to be accessed in communities. And so. I don't know how we make that happen. I'm not a chair manufacturer, unfortunately, but it could be talking to our current chair manufacturers and speaking with them on how they can change the way they make chairs or make a lower cost chair or something that is more accessible to the general, I don't want to say general public, but just your average kid with a disability or family that has a kid with a disability on top of all of the other costs that are out there for them. I think one of the things that is in place that's really nice is there are a lot of granting organizations that will grant money for sport equipment for kids with disabilities, which is pretty nice, or adults with disabilities too. So that's helpful, but I think one of the things that I'm more interested in is like, how do we get that equipment cost down? And then how do we get it out to more people, organizations, rural communities, so that whatever sport it is, like they have access to. I don't have a great answer right now, but it's something that I, would love to brainstorm on.
One of the things that I think is also important is trying to figure out how to truly connect through school systems, because bringing the equipment costs down is super important, and then figuring out how to have that intersect with school systems would also be, it would be a game changer, no pun intended, for adapted sports, because what happens right now is, and this, I didn't make it up when I said we would, follow someone in the mall with a, limp, because that is literally how we find some of our athletes. We don't necessarily have great access to a lot of the schools around here, and we reach out to the schools, but you know, I work at a special recreation association, which is connected through park districts. And we find some of our athletes through those park districts and through some of the programs that they're in. But, you know, our team has nothing to do with the school. And the state of Illinois does, the State High School Association does sponsor a state wheelchair basketball tournament, and we're one of only, 2 or 3 states that are doing that right now, so that's a big deal. But at the same time, those 5 and 6 and 7-year-olds who are probably not being included in their PE programs at school because they have a physical disability, if they had access to low-cost equipment that could be available in their schools so that they could learn to be active, not necessarily even learn basketball or learn how to be a track athlete, but with their peers, learn those motor skills and learn the foundations of being active, I think would be a huge game changer for sports for people with disabilities, because that is actually what we're finding is we get an athlete who is sometimes, you know, 10, 11, 12, sometimes even 16, and that child with a disability has never been active. So they have no foundation for those, a lot of those skills, those motor skills that make, you know, are the foundation of becoming an athlete. And that, to me, would be a huge way to kind of overcome some of those barriers that we're seeing, is try to figure out how to not just have the low-cost equipment, but also provide it in schools, because those schools are touching those kids, you know, early in life and teaching and cementing some of those things really early in life. Okay, next question. What type of media coverage would you like to see for athletes with disabilities or disabled sports?
I won't go as far as saying like the same amount of coverage as, you know, the able-bodied sports, but it's at least more to educate and inform the ones that do not know, you know, what the sport consists of or what it takes to get accessibility to the sport. At least give the foundational coverage where everyone can feel like they at least know, and if they want to participate or know someone with a disability, you know, they can provide them with this research, or you can go watch this and you'll get coverage to learn about it. I think just a little bit more than that's been displayed recently. Like the Paralympics really don't get a lot of coverage, and it's kind of sad, because I think sport is like a therapeutic release, you know, for people with disabilities to be able to perform, but you would never know that because it's not even on live TV all the time. You got to go and find it, you know, and I think that's pretty sad.
I do think that there's a definite increase that I would like to see adapted sport. I'd like to see there be no separation between between the definitions and the coverage. But I also am realistic enough to know that the reason stuff's on TV is because somebody's paying for it to be on TV. So from that aspect, there's some real challenges there in helping businesses see the value in advertising during adapted sport. And I do think from watching this past Paralympics, Katie and I have a 3-year-old daughter, and being able to watch for the first time in our real life, Steph and her you know, amazing team of athletes participate halfway, you know, around the world in terms of competing on an international level, on my laptop with my daughter sitting on her lap going, this is the world that we live in, brought tears to my eyes. And that was really cool. And the cool thing is each one of us has a media device in our hand. And so if the more we share this stuff, you guys are all media tycoons. So part of it is on us, and then part of it is on the business aspect to help these businesses understand that there are marketing dollars behind advertising in adapted sports.
Yeah, and I think that it's certainly come a long way. You know, speaking from, I competed in 2008, 2004 in the Paralympic Games, and then came back around to it this past year, and just the difference in just lead up and commercials and the choice of athletes that are being used to put into commercials. You see big time companies now sponsoring athletes, Paralympic athletes. You know, names like Tatiana McFadden. You guys will meet Josh George later tonight on the last panel, both of whom are sponsored by BMW. That's a big deal. You know, Tatiana is sponsored by Coca-Cola. That's a big deal. And so it's moving in the right direction, I think. You know, that's more so from the advertising perspective. I think once those advertisers latch on to, like Mike said, that there's value in athletes with disabilities and that there's a certain part of the demographic that's going to latch on to that student athlete, I'm used to being on campus. Latch onto that athlete and they'll find something that they connect with, right? And they connect it with that product. I think then it goes more into, all right, we're going to put this on TV more. These are the companies that have already invested in this. When you throw out a name like a BMW or a Coca-Cola or BP or McDonald's or, you know, those are big time companies. And I think, you know, that hopefully puts a little bit of pressure on some other companies to say, all right, these companies are finding value in these athletes. What are we missing? And then taking that next step forward. I'm not a media tycoon in the room, and so this is just from my inside perspective of sport looking out into media. We have some really cool stories with athletes, not so much inspirational stories where we sort of focus on the inspiration porn part. I'm not sure if you guys have heard of that or know what it is, but not so much from that perspective, but the fact that they have like really awesome stories and they're really awesome athletes. And how do you combine that to tell their story from a perspective of this is what happened, this is what they've achieved, this is how they're moving forward.
I think that's one of the things that, from my standpoint as a coach, that I've noticed over the last 15 years is that, you know, on multiple occasions, numerous occasions, we've had a member of the media contact us to cover our team or, you know, something during the state tournament or something. And more often than not, it's not the sports writer who contacts us and who covers that. So I think one of the things we've really tried to advocate for is that that coverage is through that sports media, because we're often seen as a little bit of a feel-good sort of movie that's going on, as opposed to you know, our athletes, you know, our junior athletes, they want to be seen as athletes first, and quite frankly, they want to be seen as athletes only, you know, most of the time. And like Stephanie said, you know, certainly there's some really cool stories there, and there's never really, you know, a problem with kind of covering that cool story. But what we find a lot of times is that people want to cover that sort of like, you know, B-roll, what we consider the B-roll story, as opposed to, you know, our kids putting the basketball through the hoop. And that's what they want to talk about. They want to talk about putting the basketball through the hoop. And Mike tells a story about how I was interviewed by a local reporter one time, and he really, this reporter really, and it was even a sports reporter, I think, really wanted to talk about like how inspirational it was that these kids were out there on the basketball court. And I just kept coming back to, you know, these kids just want to win a state championship. And I just kept saying to him, these kids just want to win a state championship. And he kept talking about, well, you know, these kids, look at what they've had to overcome to get to this. And they don't feel like they've had to overcome anything to push up and down that basketball court. They really don't. They, you know, and every athlete has to overcome something, sure, but they really see themselves as athletes, and I think that's how they want the media to perceive them as well. And more often than not, I think that doesn't happen.
Yeah, I think what's important to realize too, like, and this could be as communication students or journalism students, like that your words hold a lot of power. And so the words that are chosen in either print media or online media or TV, like they hold power and they change the way that people see other people, right? And so, you know, I've never been more frustrated than I pick up a news article or I listen to a news article and you hear words like wheelchair bound or words that indicate, you know,
Confined.
what's that?
Confined.
Yeah, confined to a wheelchair, right? And I think that creates a picture, right? Like words help us create pictures. And so that creates a picture of someone who's not an athlete in my mind, right? Like when I hear confined to a wheelchair, I think of someone who can't get out, who can't do anything for themselves, who like they're not out on the court or they're not out on the track or they're not out on a tennis court, you know, competing at a high level or competing with their peers. And so I think it's important to remember that our words do have power, and the words that we choose to use on a daily basis, whether it's our written communication, online, TV, whatever that media is, that you guys are help creating the picture of how people see others with disabilities, whether they're athletes or not. That's just kind of a general thing. And so that's one of the things that I always look for in stories that are written about either our athletes or just individuals with disabilities in general. So choose your words well.
And on that same point, Katie has, when she's presenting about, you know, people first language, one of the things that she always asks people to do is, if you are going to replace wheelchair with some other defining, you know, something defining a minority group, how would that, you know, how would that be received? How would that be reflected? And so I really look forward to the day where I can read a news article or a sports article and the chair isn't a determining factor in that. It's, here is an amazing athlete, here are the things that they have overcome through sport in order to excel. And oh, by the way, they just happen to use a chair, or they just happen to, you know.
Well, speaking of your words, we promised you questions. Does anyone have questions?
I don't have a question, I'm just passing on the mic, so it's your turn.
So you talked about how money might be an issue in terms of getting equipment for these sports. I was wondering if there have been any efforts, like I know you said you're from the University of Illinois, if there's any efforts along other college campuses to maybe not just get the equipment for an actual team, but maybe just have it in the recreational facilities for people to use. Is money really the only obstacle on that front, and are there fronts that are trying to move that forward?
That's a really good question. I know there are quite a few universities around the country that are doing just that. Actually, they have chairs within their recreation center. Ohio State does, I'm pretty sure. We have an alumni that works at Clemson, I believe. I think that's where Jeff Townsend works. He's bought, I think, like 10 basketball wheelchairs, which could be used for basketball, tennis, other sports. And when he was down actually in Mississippi, can't remember which university he was at down there, but they did the same thing. So I know that there are efforts in that area. Now, a lot of them are spurred on by someone who's in the disability sport community. So I think that's one part of, or one piece that could be a barrier to that, is that education piece of why it's important to have access, them accessible at, you know, recreation centers or places where you don't necessarily have a wheelchair basketball team or a wheelchair track team or a tennis team. So there are a few universities around the country that do that. I know there are also some that run intramural programs within their recreation centers. So the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater, they have a wheelchair basketball program, but they also have about 15 or 20 extra chairs. And just like you have intramural basketball, soccer, flag football, whatever other sports you have on campus, they also have an intramural wheelchair basketball league. And so I think, you know, there are creative ways to have those be inclusive in your recreation center programming without necessarily having a disability sport team or program on your campus. So yes, and that's a couple of the barriers Michigan face.
And I think it's also a supply and demand thing. I mean, you know, we look at Canada. Canada allows individuals without disabilities to participate in wheelchair basketball. In the US, we haven't really wrapped our brain around that. And so, you know, so is money the only barrier? No. Finding the kids, because if we had six times the number of kids we had here, the money wouldn't be an issue. So it's a multifaceted thing, so.
And I went out to Rutgers last year and did this huge accessibility assessment of a lot of their campuses, their main campus up in Camden and up in Newark. And, you know, the Mike is right, like their concern wasn't the money, it was how are we gonna get the students with disabilities to come here and use this equipment if we do purchase it, so, yeah. Absolutely.
One of the things in the state of Illinois that we're really lucky to have, and you know, I'm going to promote my agency a little bit here, but in Illinois, we have a system of special recreation associations, and that's, there's legislation actually that's from the 60s that creates special recreation associations. It allows park districts to partner, and when they partner, they can levy a tax specifically for recreation programs for people with disabilities. So we actually have in Illinois what I would say is probably the strongest system of adapted sports for youth right here, believe it or not. You hear about, you know, the state of Illinois and how horrible the funding is for everything. But we really have the only successful special recreation system in the country. And, you know, we have figured out, we've always made a commitment, Mike and I have, you know, and I did 15 years ago when I started the team, we've always made a commitment that we are not gonna let money be the obstacle for, you know, a junior level athlete to access sport. So we've been really lucky in this community that people have sort of answered that call. Like Stephanie said, there's some grant opportunities, but even local businesses. A couple of years ago, I started sort of an equipment loan program, which we were already sort of doing from a wheelchair basketball standpoint. We were already sort of doing it with our basketball chairs, but Running Central purchased a track chair or a couple of track chairs. We've got some hand cycles, and those are actually available for loan. So we have people in the community or around the community who will borrow those things for certain periods of time, maybe to train for a road race, different things like that. So creative programs like that really could kind of help, you know, whether it's campuses or whatever, overcome that barrier for sure. Any other questions?
What's the biggest thing as a college student that could help bring awareness or help the athletes or just help the cause of adaptive sports?
That's a big question. Go ahead, you go ahead.
I think just letting a person know when you talk to them that, you know, you find value in what they're doing and what they're trying to do for their community and others. You know, it's not just about people with disabilities. It's about everybody and learning how to inform them and educate them on, you know, this is a way for a community to come together, because I think that's what sport is about, bringing people together and teaching those intangibles, sacrifice, commitment, love. So showing the person with the disability who's trying to, you know, advocate for that, let him know that, you know, I see what you're doing, you know, is value in it, and going forward, it's going to pay huge dividends down the road.
You know, it's a big question, and it deserves a really good answer, and I'm not sure I necessarily have one. I think just sharing it. I mean, sharing, if you find interest in something, you know, each one of us has this network of people that you're connected to, and I think that's a really powerful thing that a lot of times just ends up being what I had for dinner last night. And so, you know, kind of sharing things with people that you find to be cool. Also getting involved. I mean, put your time and your energy behind something and maybe it'll turn into something. You know, there's one of my favorite quotes is Charlie Tremendous Jones says, "You'll be the same person you are in 5 years, except for the people you meet and the books you read." And so get out and meet some people. And so, you know, it's,
And I think too, it's, got that close. I think it's sort of the way you see disability. I think it's understanding, you know, seeing it in a different light, in a different paradigm, more so from a perspective what they can do to, like, that they're completely capable of doing, you know, anything that any other college student is doing. You know, it's having expectations of anyone that you meet with a disability, not being shocked that they're a college student or not being shocked that they're an athlete. I think that goes a long way. And then I think, too, for those of you guys that are either communications, journalism majors, whatever it might be, seek out the story of athletes with disabilities, or, you know, seek out the story that's not being told right now, because there are so many stories that aren't being told. Some that are being told, but, you know, there's a lot, I think, of stories that, you know, are waiting to be written. And so I think, you know, it's doing the homework and doing the hard part of seeking out that story as well. And then just talking about it. Now that you know about it, talk about it. Talk about it, talk about it, talk about it to anybody that'll listen to you. Like, I don't shut up about it a lot of times. So, yeah, talk about it. Do you have anything?
I actually was going to say a lot of what Steph said, but I think that as future professionals, go experience it, because that's the other thing that I think is super powerful where you guys are right now. You know, we let almost anyone come to our practice and get in a chair and try it out and play a pickup game with the kids. We come, try it out, experience the sport, whether it's as a spectator or someone who's getting in the chair. I think that is really powerful, because I think that when people generally hear about sports and they intersect that with people with disabilities, they think that, oh, isn't that probably a really sweet thing? But the sports that we're talking about and we're discussing today are highly competitive sports, and I think that surprises people sometimes. And I think that if you have an opportunity, or you can find the opportunity to sort of experience that, then you can sort of apply that to whatever your future profession is, as if it's as a journalist in the media, if it's as, you know, a therapist, a teacher, whatever you might be doing. It will sort of help you open up those doors for future athletes earlier and earlier in their life. And I think that's important.
Hi. First, I want to thank all of you for this panel and for your work and for the medals. Katie, how did you get started 15 years ago? Tell us the story of your organization and how you got started and what motivated you.
Sure. Well, when I was in 6th grade, my school was connected to a school for kids with disabilities, and they had this fence around kids for their recess, and we never interacted with what most people called those kids. We didn't know who they were, we didn't know their names. So I started volunteering in the school during my study halls, and I started learning people's names. And I started learning that they were people and they had lives, and that was a really big turning point for me in regard to my decision to work in a profession that served people with disabilities. So I went to Bradley. I studied social work and psychology, and I operated group homes for quite a while. And I had grown up working for the local park districts, helping people access recreation. I sometimes been an inclusion aide for a person with a disability in programs, and I really enjoyed that. So when the opportunity to work for the Heart of Illinois Special Recreation Association came, I was really excited about it. And I was hired as their director about 15 years ago. And the one thing we didn't have, we were operating a lot of Special Olympics programs. We provided a lot of opportunities for athletes with intellectual disabilities to compete. but we had no opportunities for athletes with physical disabilities to compete. So I started a wheelchair basketball program, and actually, Stevie Corey's over here. He was my first athlete. He was driving 3 hours to play and practice on a Saturday afternoon, and I thought it was ridiculous that in Peoria, we didn't have an opportunity for him to play basketball. So I started a team. I knew nothing about wheelchair basketball at the time, absolutely nothing. I'd never played. I'd never really even seen the sport, but I thought, I'm going to start a team, and so here I am.
Any other questions?
So you guys kind of mentioned at the start about the medical stigma from the medical model perspective. How, as a future parent, I guess, but how can we, like, if there's a situation arises where you have a child with a disability or not, you want them to get into that sport, how can you kind of, I guess, help break down the medical model, I guess? Because I know that we talked about the physicians and all those people that are telling kids to constantly get out of that wheelchair. How can you kind of encourage your kid, in that situation, to play sport despite all of that? Like, what specifically can be done?
So I come at this from kind of a unique perspective. When you look at me and you see me walk off the stage, you're not going to notice anything about my physical appearance. When I was born with mild cerebral palsy. My right Achilles did not form properly, and so what that meant was that I walked on the heel of my left foot, but that I couldn't bend my right ankle, so I walked on my toe on my right foot. When I was 4, I fell down a flight of stairs, broke my leg in 2 places. My parents had the wherewithal to contact a surgeon who then was able to surgically stretch that Achilles. When I was born and when I was going through learning to walk, doctors told my parents that I would never walk normally. I would never run. I would never play sports. Part of the difficulty with the medical model is that you have people who they want to be analytical. They don't want to set people up for failure. They want to help people be realistic about the expectations, because the thought is, well, if they do better, great, but if they do worse, then I've failed. Part of our job in communicating about this is to help doctors, and I think this has changed quite a bit, is to help them realize that it's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to be wrong, especially when talking with especially when talking with parents and kids, and say, look, I don't know what the future will hold for your son or daughter, but what I do know is that there are an infinite number of possibilities, and depending on what your child's condition is, there are multiple options for them. Everything from, watching Paralympics and some of these athletes who are quadriplegics, who are playing bocce by using their heads and a pointer stick is just phenomenal. The accuracy and the detail that goes into something like that, we have no ability as people to tell other people what they can and can't do, and I think we need to change that from the medical perspective. Instead of saying what your athlete or what your son or daughter can't do, instead of saying, I think physical therapists and doctors need to say, I don't know, but here are some resources so that you can go down and find that journey yourself.
Yeah, I come at it from sort of the same perspective that Mike does. So I was injured when I was 6 years old, and so I had, a little bank of experience of what it was like to be able-bodied and to have my family around me as an able-bodied kid. And as soon as I was injured, the first thing that my physical therapists and doctors and family wanted me to do was get in long leg braces and crutches and walk, right? That's the first thing they want you to do is walk. And that holds value. It does. It holds value for therapeutic purposes and, you know, making sure your bone structure stays intact and all that good stuff, right? But like, I could not function well. Like, I was on these crutches, I couldn't carry my backpack at school, I couldn't carry my lunch tray. There were all these things that I couldn't do. And so while I had family and doctors and physical therapists telling me I could do anything that I want, I could walk, they didn't realize how actually limiting that was for me. And so I was really lucky that I had a great family support system around me that when I wanted to kick the leg braces aside, so to speak, and use a wheelchair full time, I was allowed to do that because I could demonstrate how freeing it was. Like, I actually think like making the transition from walking on leg braces to using a wheelchair was the absolute most freeing experience of my life. Because then I could carry my backpack, I could carry my tray at school, I could go hang out with my friends outside, I could actually play on the monkey bars and do all the things that in my leg braces and crutches, there's absolutely no way that I could do. And so through this effort of trying to make me as, quote, normal or normalized or as close to able-bodied as I possibly could be, in that whole process, they were actually limiting me and clipping me and taking me away from what I could do. And so I kind of always go back to this quote of a lot of times when you're a person with a disability, like, it's better to fail at being able-bodied than to succeed at being disabled. And like, it's really important that we kind of get in our minds that it's okay to succeed at being disabled. Like, myself and Taylor and then VA or Mike and the folks that you'll meet tonight, like, we are rocking being disabled. And that's all right. Like, that is totally okay. And so it's moving away from that whole notion of, no, we want to get you as close to able-bodied as we possibly can, versus how can we make you the most functional that you possibly can be.
Yeah, I think one of the mistakes that doctors and other medical professionals do is they try to give you an identity. Like, and that's the thing, instead of you finding your own pathway, being disabled, how can you figure out and how do you maneuver around these obstacles? They try to put you in this box instead of, as a normal person, you know, you tend to go through obstacles, go through failure, success, and then you kind of find your niche. You know, that's what we're able to do too, and that's the thing I think they kind of mess up on. They try to give you an identity, like, this is what your life is going to be, this is what you'll be able to do. But let us find our own way. Let us find what we enjoy and succeed in. Like Stephanie said, like, let's rock on being disabled. So that's the beauty of it.
Thank you very much for being here and for this excellent panel. Please help me thank the panelists. So I know some of you have been in session since 9 a.m., so we decided to give you a break.
All right.
You're allowed to go eat, and then please come back for our final session of this year's symposium. It's going to be at 6:30, and we will be traveling to Rio, right, to London, to Beijing probably, and maybe Athens. Stephanie Wheeler, Coach Wheeler, will be joining us on that panel again, as well as 3 other athletes who recently competed in Rio and in London at the Paralympic Games. And I think altogether they have collected 8 medals. So it's a very impressive lineup, and we will continue some of our conversations about media, sponsorship, the Paralympic movement, and so forth. So I hope that you can join us. Thank you for being here.